the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you are answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. At the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
I'm going to cover 2 or 3 areas for sustainability, and the common theme in those areas is scale and complexity. Okay? And before I start the presentation, I'll see if this link works. I want you to jot down the last 6 numbers of that. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to jot the last 6 numbers again. And this will give you the increase in the world population during my lecture. Okay? It is important because the first 2 or 3 slides will show you what the problem is. Okay? So let me escape from this. Do you take it down? Yes. Okay, great. So let me shut this down and continue with the presentation. So I searched around to find out what is the definition of sustainability, a sustainable development. And there are 2 definitions that are most commonly used. One is the one defined in the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, which says that this sustainable development is to create and maintain conditions under which humans and nature can exist in productive harmony that permit fulfilling the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations. So nature, economic growth, and social well-being, right? The 3 dimensions of sustainability. So it makes a direct association with those 3 elements of it. The next definition that is circulating in the literature is one of the Brundtland Commission in the United Nations meeting of 1987, which says sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Makes no reference to economic growth, it makes no reference to environmental sustainability or ecological well-being, and neither social well-being. So, but that's not here nor there, right? This, I'm sure you have already, those of you that study environmental and sustainability, you've seen before. But these are the 2 most popular definitions of sustainability. The next graph will give you an idea why today we're talking about sustainability. And this is a graph of the human population, the global population, from the first time the first modern humans appeared about 160,000 years ago to projected to 2150, but we're just about here now. 2015, 16, 17, we're 2017, we're about there. And that's why you saw the numbers on the counter, the population counter, in close to 7.5 billion people. In 1800, we just broke 1 billion. So if population growth in the globe was at the same slope as it was for the first 158,000 years of human existence, the modern human existence, we wouldn't be talking about sustainability, right? Because that slope will be going like that, and by 2150, would be somewhere around here, which will be breaking a little bit higher than 1 billion, right there. Right? Less than 1 billion, as a matter of fact, if I took this slope out. Less than 1 billion. But now we're finding ourselves with 7.5 billion people on this planet. The next graph shows the issue again in a different dimension. The same graph in terms of population, but a little bit the most recent years, from 1750 onward to 2050. But it breaks the curve into two parts. One is the population in industrialized countries, and the other one is in developing countries. Right? And you can see that even in projections, the population within the industrialized countries is going to be less than 1.5 billion, or it is now, about there. Whereas the rest, 6 billion people, are living in developing countries. Okay. And the next chart shows you where these people are. This is a composite of a night shot of the Earth, and you can see the clusters of population in the northern United States, a little bit on the eastern part of South America, Europe, India, China, Japan, and a little bit in South Africa. Right? The rest of the globe is not populated as densely. But this is where these 7.5 billion people are. Okay, do we have someone on the phone?
Korfiatis.
Yeah. Someone at the...
No.
No, okay.
Okay.
All right. So, this graph shows you how money is distributed amongst this population, how wealth is distributed. So, 68.7% of the population owns 3% of the global wealth, right? And this accounts for both money and non-financial assets such as houses, so forth. 13.7% of the wealth goes to the next 22.9%. 7.7 own 42.3 of the global wealth, and 0.7% of the people own 41% of the wealth. That's why we're talking about sustainability and sustainable development, right? This inequality in wealth distribution causes a tremendous heartache and headache in a huge number of people around the globe that they live under disadvantaged economic conditions, which then in turn bring in the heartache around the social condition and the environmental condition for the matter. So there's also a couple of different schematics of sustainability and sustainable development. Some of them shows the three ellipses or three circles where the circles intersect, you have a sustainable development, right? Others, and this is a notional view, saying that there are three components to it, three vectors. Others shows the environment as a super system, because that's what sustains everything in Earth, and the social subsystem and the economic subsystem below it. Right? And we will move in now into, if I was to separate the scales, give you a scale view of what affects sustainability and sustainable behavior, you can start at the base of the pyramid being composed of us, individual people, right? Go up to the workplace and company and industry, where we go and work, organizations, communities, municipalities, where we live, regions and states, larger subdivision, countries. I put in here federations. This is what is a conglomerate of countries that they share maybe governance principles, or such as the EU, for example, 28 countries in the Eurozone, for example, that they share regulations and other things. And of course, at the apex of the pyramid is the globe. And then you can put enablers and drivers. And this have no specific ordering here, but you talk about technology, education, awareness, incentives, legal framework, funding, advocacy, infrastructure, enforcement, culture. I'm sure you can add a few more in here in terms of what drives across all these scales. And I have broken them down a little bit, starting from the bottom. And I could not fit everything in one pyramid, so I formed three pyramids, but it's okay, you understand what I'm talking about. The people, culture, education, infrastructure, and awareness are the, by the way, I say impediments here, right? So every driver, if it doesn't exist, is also an impediment, right? To progressing towards sustainable development, sustainability. Education and culture, awareness, and infrastructure. And some of them are repeated in a lot of scales, in most of the scales, such as culture, for example. A workplace, economics comes into play, right? Is it economical for a company to put the dimension of sustainability in their operations? Technology, what's available, incentives, and culture, what incentives is getting. And if you go further out, communities, again, infrastructures, funding, legal framework starts entering, right? We have regulations, rules and regulations at the lowest form of government, right? The municipal government. Regions and states, you go into legal framework, culture enforcement, and funding again, right? At the level of countries, culture exists still, economics, politics, and laws. Right? Again, economics and funding, politics and law. Enforcement, corruption comes into play. Okay? And then you start getting into the levels of socioeconomic inequalities amongst countries of different economic growth and development. And, going down. And finally, in federations, again, it's the geopolitical realities, because now you have a conglomerate of countries that they might have totally, they might have disparities in their economic well-being, in their governance, in the governing party of the day, in the government, and so forth and so on. Socioeconomic inequalities, transboundary issues. What happens when two countries share a river, for example, and one pollutes it and the other one cleans it, as an example. And then at the global level, we have socioeconomic inequalities and inequities and very large-scale global impacts. When I talk a little bit about complexity, I will give you an example of the large-scale global impact. But climate change for example, and the greenhouse effect are global impacts, right? The hole in the ozone layer is a global impact of that magnitude. So we hear about countries being at different levels of development. Underdeveloped countries, medium developed countries. Do you know how a country is classified as by its level of development? Huh?
GDP.
It's GDP literacy.
Okay, GDP. Anybody else?
Depends on which economic sector most people are working in, whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, services,
Okay.
knowledge.
HDI.
HDI, yes. There's an index that has been developed to classify countries, right? And this is called the Human Development Index, right? And the Human Development Index has three dimensions. One is health, the other is knowledge, and the other is standard of living. And the indicators are life expectancy at birth, right? You expect more developed countries to have larger life expectancy at birth. Mean years of schooling, again, larger in developed countries. And gross national income, again, larger in developed countries, right? And each of them leads into an index, and the composite index is called the Human Development Index, right? So if you look at how it breaks down, the Human Development Index from 0.8 to 1, 49 countries are highly developed. The high human development from 0.7 to 0.8, 56 countries. Medium human development from 0.55 to 0.7, 39. And low human development less than 0.55, 44 countries. Right? That's how the UN is classified. If I am to take the definition that we mentioned before, right? What's missing out of this HDI? We said health, education, and wealth, right? So we have two social issues, health and schooling, and one economic issue, GNI, right? We don't have the environment there, right? But by definition, we said that sustainability has three major dimensions. Do you understand my point? Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. So that struck me when I was reading about this a few months ago. So I said, let's do some analysis, right? And see how HDI, so I put a question out. How is HDI correlated to the environmental sustainability performance at the country scale? Right? Because the HDI is not derived taking into consideration the environmental performance of a country. Correct? So I picked 8 different parameters that you can say are correlated, and they're correlated to environmental performance for sure. So CO2 emissions per capita, CO2 emissions reduction or increase per capita for a period of 2000-2011, 10 years, 11 years of municipal waste recycled as percent of the total municipal waste, energy supply per capita, electricity produced from renewables, terrestrial and marine protected areas, such as parks and so forth and so on, populations connected to wastewater treatment, and agricultural land, percent of the land that's used for agriculture. And then we run regression analysis for 44 countries that I can find data for, a complete set of data for these 8 variables, right? Across the spectrum from low HDI to high HDI. As you can imagine, the information becomes scarcer are low HDI countries because they don't report it. Don't have the infrastructure to report it. So the next round of analysis that we need to do to get a more accurate picture has to include more countries at this level here of low HDI. Right? Just gonna say that up front. So if you look at HDI versus CO2 emissions, we'll run a linear regression and a power regression, and we see that we get some fairly good R-square for the power curve, right? And we'll go down, and of course, what this shows is that countries with higher HDI, right, have also higher emissions per capita, CO2 emissions. That's to be expected. The next one is CO2 emissions percent change from 2000 to 2011. And then it's a fairly straight line, the correlation, but so let me just orient you on the graph in here. This is 0. This is reduction, and this is increase of CO2 over the past this 11-year period, right? Reduction is the minus, increase is the positive side, and this is right, no change in a country's CO2 emissions. And you see that countries with, and this is HDI. So you see that countries with high HDI, you have reductions because they're putting a lot of effort into curbing CO2 emissions. You see countries with low HDI having increases. Now, if you look at the distribution of HDIs that I gave you, most of the countries lie within this region, right? Now, later on in the presentation, I have a graph for the same period for 192 countries that shows you what's the net reduction over those 11-year period and what's the net increase in CO2 emissions. And then we'll continue. Now, water recycled, waste recycled. Again, the next is energy supply per capita. And again, here the power correlation gives you a better fit. What is this? HDI versus renewable energy. See, very low correlation. Anybody can tell me why? Renewable energy is sometimes very much associated with what is the resource in a particular country, no matter if they're rich or if they're poor, right? So for example, this country of Colombia is getting almost 100% of their electricity out of hydroelectric power. Why? Because it's available, and they have put the infrastructure together to harvest it. As a matter of fact, they're exporting to the neighbors. Okay, so there's not much correlation between the level of development of a country and if they're using the renewable resources or not. It's all contrary to intuitive thinking, you see, right? The other one is also that coal and oil are expensive commodities. And if you don't have it, you have to import it. And if you have to import it, it costs you money. If you don't have money, you live with wood-burning stoves, right? So, renewable electricity, very low correlation, same thing. Percent of protected areas, very low correlation. Why? Because a poor African country might designate millions of acres or millions of square kilometers of preservation land where hunting lions, for example, is not permitted or whatever. And a small country in the middle of Europe, so they don't have much land to live, they have less proportional land. So percent of protected areas is not really correlated very well. Population connected to wastewater, very good correlation. And agroland, the percent of land covered by agriculture, it is correlated somewhat with the lower HDI, the higher HDI countries having less land, and the lower HDI countries having more land as agroland because they're more agricultural communities. So if you run a multivariable regressional model in these 8 variables, you can see which ones stand up as correlatable. Right? So it turns out the CO2 emissions, municipal waste recycled, and connectivity to municipal wastewater treatment are the best indicators correlated to the Human Development Index with a fairly good R-square of about 0.8. So you can kind of run a parametric model and come up with an HDI if you know what the environmental performance in these 3 parameters are within a country. So this was one exercise that we did. So as conclusions, we see center environmental sustainability outputs are correlatable, others are not. It would be useful to perform further regression analysis involving more parameters, but more importantly, as I mentioned in the beginning, it will be interesting to get countries or get data from countries that they have fairly low HDIs so that you complete the picture, because we do find many data in that area. And can the HDI concept been adapted to use as sub-country scales in the regional and municipal communities in a country as it correlates, of course, to the environmental performance of that. So we'll move on now to the grand challenges. If you look at how they have been set, education and awareness, socioeconomic inequality, and complexity are the 3 grand challenges in having this harmony between social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainability. So let's look at, this is a list of the top 10 global concerns in 2014 by the World Economic Forum. Every year they put them out. This happens to be the 2014 list. Global concern number 1, rising societal tensions in the Middle East and North Africa. A lot of instability, a lot of political instability, wars, famine, and all the good stuff you hear in the newspapers all the time, in the TV all the time. The widening income disparities, we talked about that. And that is increasing significantly. I'll give you some numbers. Persistent structural unemployment across the globe. Another one. Intensifying cyber threats puts a lot of uncertainty to the picture. Inaction on climate change, number 5. Number 6, the diminishing confidence in economic policies. There is a lot of confusion in the eyes of people about interpretation of actions on the economic side and their future impacts that they're going to have in their lives. Right? The diminishing confidence, the lack of values in leadership. This is extremely important. It has been manifesting itself across the globe, and it will be manifesting itself across the globe. The public thinks that our politicians stink. The political leaders are out for themselves and not for the good of the people. So yesterday I was watching CNN, and they happened to be talking about the issue of the repealing of the Obamacare. And every single politician that went up there talked about that they have to do it fast, because the midterm elections coming in 2 years and going to be disastrous for the Republicans if they don't do it fast. So me, as a poor citizen that I'm looking around, and I said, listen, I got to insure my family. And saying, what the hell is that guy's priority? Is it for him to get reelected next year? And that's what has put in this, the lack of values in leadership and the diminishing confidence level that we have on our governing bodies is a huge societal issue. The expanding middle class in Asia, another big issue that impacts sustainability. As of 2014, there were 500 million people in Asia classified in the middle class. By 2020, they expect that to increase to 1.75 billion, more than 3 times the then numbers. The impact of that, this is astonishing. The rate at which people are moving to the middle class is reflective of the rate of population change that I showed you in the first slide. Right? So the impact of that in terms of resource allocation or resource demand is going to be tremendous in a very accelerated fashion. The growing importance of mega cities, and especially those along the coastal regions of the world, which is most of the cities are, and the impact that climate change and sea level rise will have in those cities is another concern. And the rapid spread of misinformation online, which is a whole science of its own, of how lies are propagating and how long does it take for a lie to diminish after it hits the social networks. But it's interesting to think in those dimensions because it gives you a level of the complexity of the issues that you have to deal with when you talk about sustainable development, because don't forget, economic, social, and environmental. So in terms of education, the UN had the decade of education for sustainable development. You go online and look for it, and look at this. But basically, we had several objectives. 10 years went by. There are some results. It kind of ended in 2014, and from there on, we went to this global action program. The results are that a framework has been set. A number of some examples in primary, secondary education are evident. Better success in vocational and corporate education settings as opposed to the normal STEM core education of kids. In higher education, it has made an impact. So the results are mixed of 10 years of persistent programming around education awareness. And in my mind, I have a single reference point, which is this. I took this picture. This building right here is the main classroom building of a major university overseas. And right across from it is the chancellery. Where is the chancellor going? He's sitting every day. Okay? The irony of everything is, I think, because I went close and I looked, I think these bins that they had in here, there were composting bins. Just to put in there, just to put there grass and leaves that they collect from the surrounding area. And look at this. There were some dates in there that were like 6, 7 years old of newspapers and stuff like that, papers. Okay? This is right in the middle of an institution of higher education. Single point, but nevertheless very profound in my mind, that the educational side of the house is lacking significantly. The social and economic inequality, of course, is very evident, and I will not elaborate with a comment, but I will give you another graph where this gives you the 4 sets of data, actually. It's actually 3 sets of data. One is population, the red, as a percent of the total population. This is for year 2000, but the picture did not change significantly. The next one is percent of the world net worth in purchasing power parity units. And then the light green is the percent of the world net worth in exchange rate units. The blue one is the percent of the world GDP in purchasing power units, and the other one is the percent of the world GDP in exchange rates. What is evident here is that the US and Canada, with 5% of the global population, have more than 35% of the purchasing power of the world. Central and South America are down. If I put US and Europe, I end up with about 15% of the world population, with about 80% of the purchasing power. All the rest of the countries are not 80%. The purchasing power is about 30, 60, it's about 75. 70. So this is a significant picture of inequality, which means that the standards of living of these countries have to come up, will come up, they're due to come up, and then the load to the environmental resources and the conservation will increase dramatically. Okay, so talk about CO2. So this is the CO2, the annual global fossil fuel carbon emissions for the past, since 1850 onward to 2014. And they're broken down to solid, which is coal, liquid, gas, cement production, and gas flaring. There's there are 5 major components of putting CO2 into the atmosphere from fossil fuels, right? And if you pile them up, you'll see that last 2014, I think, 2013-14 period, we had close to about 9,000 million metric tons of carbon per year loaded into the atmosphere. So, what do we know? When did we know? In 1820, Fourier was a French mathematician, right? The one that you done Fourier transforms, Fourier series, right? The same Fourier. Talked for the first time about the greenhouse effect. Although not in these terms of greenhouse effect, he used the terminology of having a glass that covers the earth. It's like having a glass that covers the earth that retains heat, latent heat, within the atmosphere. Okay. Tyndall, an Irish physicist, in 1860, measured experimentally in his lab the CO2 absorption of heat and water vapor absorption of heat, for that matter. And he said that it is like a blanket that covers Earth, which holds inside. You know what the mean temperature of the Earth is?
The what?
The mean temperature of the Earth. It's about 51 degrees Fahrenheit, the mean temperature. You know what would the mean temperature be if we did not have the greenhouse effect?
Minus 60 or 70, something. Cold.
Zero.
Zero.
Which means that all the plants that die below zero would not exist. Right? So there's a beneficial side to the greenhouse. But the major storing adsorbent of heat in the atmosphere is vapor, water vapor. Right? But water vapor comes and goes, right? It's an atmospheric. The reason that CO2 is important is that CO2 stays within this blanket. Doesn't escape anywhere, right? The next one is Arrhenius. You know Arrhenius from chemistry, right? The Arrhenius equation. The global warming of CO2 versus ground temperatures. Global temperature. He identified, and he said that if we double CO2 content, the CO2 content within the atmosphere, we're going to have anywhere between 2.5 to 4.5 to 4, I think, or 4.5 degree temperature rise when that happens across the Earth. But then people said, well, you're too simplistic in your calculations because we have 75% of the Earth is covered by oceans. So there's a lot of capacity in these oceans to absorb CO2. Right? Then come the studies, was in 1955-56, of Ravel and Suze. He was from Scripps and he was from USGS. That basically say that the ocean capacity to store CO2 is minuscule. Which should us back into the fact that CO2 will float in the atmosphere. Okay? You know whether. So this is the graph that I told you of 192 countries where the net average, you see these are 0 point, this is percent increases from 1990 to 2011. 2011, it's 21 years. I kept on saying 11 years, 21 years, right? In 61 countries had reductions in their CO2. But the net output was a 51% increase over these 21 years. Why? Because you see now the increases in some of the developing countries to meet their development needs. Electricity and so forth. So, let me talk a little bit about complexity and we're going to close. 5 minutes. So, fundamentally, the ecological and socioeconomic systems are complex, adaptive systems, integrated phenomena across multiple scales of space, time, and organizational structure, and others. The complexity, if you really think about it throughout human history, has been fundamental problem-solving technique. Right? We want to solve a problem, we resort to developing some complex solutions for it. Look at the transportation, right? Horse and buggy, sailboats, cars, buses, fossil fuels come into play, more mechanical, more complexity, airplanes, space, and the shuttle. By the way, you see what happens now? The shuttle doesn't exist anymore, right? So we're going back to reusable rockets, to non-reusable rockets, to fly people and supplies to space. Why? I'll tell you in the next slide. But the societal investment in complexity unavoidably brings out the concept of ROI. What is the return on my investment? Right? So there is a concept that is called the marginal product of increasing complexity. You know, in the economics, they use a similar concept of diminishing returns, right? But basically it says that with increasing level of complexity, I might reach an apex on the benefits that I derive, and then I have a decline. Now that decline doesn't have a shape. The curve of the decline, I just depict it here as a curve because that's what I could do with my thing, my PowerPoint. But this can be like this, can be like this, or it can be like this. Right? And we have examples in human history where this has been like this. For example, the Western Roman Empire. It collapsed because it got too big to be able to be governed. Right? It's an enterprise complexity. Geopolitical. People could not be controlled from Rome. Right? You know the story of Easter Island, in Polynesia? Right? Where uncontrolled population growth and depletion of natural resources, basically they cut all the trees down. Like the sudden collapse. You know about the Maya civilization in Mexico and Belize, where Belize is now. Geopolitical, climatic, ecological collapse. So complexity in problem solving does its damage slowly, subtly, unpredictably, and sometimes and in cumulative fashion over years, over long term. So sustainability must therefore be continuously informed by history. Right? So let me give you an example of global complexity. Things that you, out of plain sight, you're not going to be able to see any correlation with. So let's correlate what's happening in the Caribbean, China, the Sahara Desert, and Brazil. Okay? So Brazil, they have, as you know, a huge problem with deforestation. Right? They're cutting the rainforest. Why they're cutting the rainforest? Because they need agricultural land. Why they need agricultural land? Because it improves their economic growth. Right? So they produce soybean in here, and the soybean value is pretty good in the market. They export it to China. Why? Because China needs to produce food for 1.3 billion people, 1.4 billion people. It's not a self-sustained country. Doesn't have the mechanization, the means, and so forth to do all this. Right? So they grow the meat and the thing, and it's food to people and food to animals for their. Now, but also China has interests back in Brazil because they have trade, but also they have interests in the Caribbean, in the tourist industry. A lot of investments in the Caribbean are from Chinese investors. The Sahara Desert, Africa, is one of their trading partners with China. The Sahara Desert, because of, and big part of Africa, because of poor agricultural practices, you have clouds of nutrient-rich sand particles floating in the air and transported thousands of miles away. So some of the sand that comes from the Sahara Desert goes to Brazil and kind of fertilizes their fields. Some of it ends up in the Caribbean and it kills the beautiful reefs. And by killing the reefs, you kill fish life, and also it's not that attractive to tourism. Okay? So trying to figure out the trade-offs and this is just 4 points in the world, right? Trying to figure out the trade-offs becomes this very complex picture that you have, because you have to integrate, again, human factors, human and natural systems integration across the dimensions that we talk, the social, the economic, and the environmental. So I will leave you with four questions, with a few questions. Can all three SD vectors, economic, social, environmental, pull in the same direction? Because traditionally, they have not been pulling in the same direction, right? It's only historically, economic and social go up, environmental goes down. This is the so-called triple constraint problem. Remember some years back, NASA, cheaper, faster, better?
Yeah.
It wasn't happening. All of a sudden you start having accidents. Right? So that's one question. Is sustainability passive? In other words, reduce consumption? The rich countries reduce consumption, the poor countries increase consumption, so we achieve global sustainability? Or active, problem solving? If it's problem solving, will the introduction of complexity to solve sustainability problems cost more, and how it can be paid, the ROI concept? And can a society be destroyed by the cost of sustaining itself? That's another issue that you have to think about. And can a society achieve resiliency before it achieves sustainability? Resiliency, Alan knows what resiliency is, right? Resiliency is the resistance to failure, right? To permanent failure. Can that happen within a society? Because we have plenty of examples, historical examples, that the contrary has happened, and that people did not become resilient enough to withstand the changes that came about. And now, by the way, eat olive oil is good for you. Let me hit this so you can take it. All right, 437.70. 437.70. Do the subtraction.
8,000.
Double die.
Births, deaths.
Yeah.
I just look at the population keep going up.
That's the net.
Look at
So births were more than the deaths.
All right.